Welcome to the Secret Library by the River, a tranquil story designed to ease your mind and guide you gently into rest. Tonight, we'll wander beneath a silvery moon, along a quiet riverbank where willows whisper in the breeze. Hidden beyond the mist lies a library untouched by time, its windows glowing softly, its shelves filled with stories that remember your dreams. As the river hums its lullaby and candlelight flickers across ancient pages, let your thoughts drift like leaves on the current. Breathe slowly, relax completely, and let the peaceful rhythm of this hidden world carry you into deep, soothing sleep. In a quiet town, cradled by the arms of two gentle hills and wrapped around by the whispering bends of a silver-blue river, there stood a place few had heard of and even fewer had seen. The locals called it the Secret Library by the River, though no one could quite recall when they first heard the name. It was a place of myth and memory, one of those stories people whispered on rainy evenings or during lazy summer afternoons when time itself seemed to stretch like honey. But for those who had ever found it, or perhaps been found by it, the library was real and it was magic. The story begins on a misty autumn evening. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, leaving behind a gentle glow that lingered like the last sigh of the day. A young woman named Alara was walking by the river, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path, her scarf fluttering in the faint breeze. She had recently moved to the town of Greystone Bend, looking for quiet, a place to heal, to breathe again. Her life before had been noise, emails, meetings, city horns, and sleepless nights. The world she left behind felt like static, and she had grown tired of chasing something she could never quite name. The river had become her refuge. Every evening after dinner, she walked beside it, watching the way the water carried away the day's light. It was on one such evening that she saw it, a faint, flickering glow through the mist, across a narrow wooden bridge she'd never noticed before. Her curiosity stirred softly, like the rustle of leaves. She followed it, each step careful and unhurried, the world around her fading into the rhythmic hush of flowing water. The bridge led her to a small island she didn't know existed, and at its center stood a building so beautiful it made her forget to breathe. It was made of stone and old wood, with ivy that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Lanterns hung by its arched windows, glowing softly like captured stars, and above the door, carved into weathered wood, were the words, "The Secret Library by the River." Alara pushed the door open, and it creaked like a sigh from another century. Inside, the air was warm and rich, the scent of parchment, tea leaves, and rain lingering in the rafters. Books filled every wall, their spines in 1,000 shades of brown, green, and gold. But there was something more, a quiet hum, a living stillness that felt almost aware. A woman sat behind a curved wooden desk, her hair silver as the moon, her eyes kind but knowing. "You found us," she said softly, as if Alara had walked into a dream. "Or perhaps we found you." Alara smiled nervously. "I didn't even know this place existed." "Few do," the woman replied, standing with a slow, graceful motion. "The library reveals itself only to those who are searching for something, even if they don't yet know what that something is." Her name was Maeve, and she was the caretaker of the library. She led Alara deeper inside, where lamps glowed along narrow aisles and the walls seemed to breathe stories. Each book, Maeve explained, was a story collected not just from authors but from lives, memories, dreams, even lost hopes that had taken shape on paper. "Books find their readers here," she said, running her fingers along a shelf. "Sometimes they even write themselves while you read." Alara ran her hands over the spines, feeling an almost imperceptible warmth. One book, bound in deep blue leather, caught her attention. The title shimmered faintly, "The River Remembers." She opened it carefully, and the pages turned themselves to a passage that read, "Some stories flow like water. They never end, only return." The words sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of recognition. It felt as though the book knew her, as though the river outside had been whispering to her all along. Maeve poured 2 cups of tea, steam curling in lazy patterns. "Stay as long as you like," she said. "The world outside will wait." And so Alara did. She sat by the fire, reading late into the night, her eyelids heavy, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. When she closed the book, she found a small note tucked between the pages. It read, "You are exactly where you need to be." Night after night, Alara returned. Each time she did, a new book seemed to call to her. Tales of forgotten gardens, of letters written to the stars, of travelers who followed the moon to find home again. Sometimes she read aloud, and she swore she could hear the walls listening, the faint rustle of turning pages that weren't her own. Maeve would tell her stories, too, of those who came before. "The library has existed for as long as the river has flowed," she said once, her gaze distant. "It gathers what people lose, dreams, words, moments of peace, and keeps them safe until someone is ready to remember them again." On one quiet winter night, snow falling softly outside, Alara found a door she had never noticed. It was small and carved with river stones, hidden behind a curtain of ivy. Maeve only smiled when Alara asked about it. "When you're ready," she said, "you'll know." Weeks passed. The world outside changed. Spring returned, the river thawed, the trees bloomed. Alara felt lighter, steadier. Her dreams were no longer restless, but filled with calm. Flowing scenes, lanterns drifting down a moonlit river, a hand writing a letter to someone unseen, the faint sound of laughter in the distance. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Alara stood before the hidden door. It was open now. Inside was a small reading room overlooking the river, lined with glass jars filled with tiny lights, fireflies, or perhaps memories. On the table sat a blank book with her name embossed on the cover. She understood then. The library didn't just keep stories, it invited new ones. Her story, her healing, her rediscovery. Alara began to write. At first slowly, uncertainly, but then with ease, as though the river itself guided her hand. The words flowed like water, soft and true. They were stories of quiet strength, of finding peace after storms, of learning to listen to the gentle things. Maeve watched from the doorway, her smile warm and proud. "Every visitor leaves something behind," she said softly. "A piece of their heart, a trace of their life. The river carries it forward, so the next soul may find their way here too." When Alara finally closed the book, dawn was breaking. The world outside shimmered in gold, the river singing softly in the distance. She turned back one last time. The library glowed like a living dream, peaceful and timeless. She crossed the bridge, the mist parting before her, and she knew she would never truly leave it behind. The secret library by the river had become part of her, its quiet magic now flowing within her, calm and endless. And as she walked home, the morning light brushing her face, she could almost hear the pages turning somewhere behind her, as if the river itself was whispering her name. Alara's visits to the library became the gentle rhythm of her days, the soft heartbeat of her new life. She began to wake up with a kind of calm expectancy, not the anxious anticipation that used to greet her mornings in the city, but a quiet, grounded curiosity about what stories the day might offer. Each evening she would follow the winding path along the river, through the reeds and whispering willow branches, until the faint golden glow of lanterns appeared across the water. There was something soothing about the ritual itself, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the faint perfume of the river's edge, damp earth, wild mint, moss. Sometimes, if the breeze was right, she could even smell the faintest trace of cinnamon and vanilla drifting from the library, as if the air itself were laced with memory. One night, as she stepped through the door, Maeve greeted her with a knowing smile. "You're starting to hear it, aren't you?" "Hear what?" Alara asked. "The river," Maeve replied, her eyes twinkling like the reflection of starlight on water. "Not with your ears, but here." She touched her chest gently. "Once you learn to listen, it will never stop speaking to you." Alara didn't answer right away, but later that evening, as she sat by the window with her tea, she closed her eyes and simply listened. Beyond the creak of wood and the hum of fire, she could hear the soft, steady murmur of the river. Not just water, but language. It spoke in memories, in sighs, in something she could feel deep within her bones. It was like listening to the earth dream. Days slipped into weeks, and seasons began to soften and turn. Spring in Greystone Bend was gentle, the kind of spring that crept quietly into your heart before you noticed it had arrived. Blossoms unfurled on the trees by the river, petals drifting like snow over the water surface. The evening stayed cool, perfect for sitting by the fire in the library's grand reading hall. There, Alara discovered a section of books that seemed to shimmer faintly when she approached. The titles were strange: The Book of Lost Sleep, The Garden That Waits in Moonlight, Whispers Between Pages. Each one seemed to glow differently depending on her mood. Maeve explained that those books weren't written by any author in the traditional sense. They are written by time itself, she said softly, by every soul who has passed through here. They're alive in a way. Alara began reading The Garden That Waits in Moonlight. Its story was about a woman who tended a garden that bloomed only under the stars, flowers that whispered secrets to her, leaves that shimmered when she wept. But what struck Alara most was how familiar it felt. She realized, with a quiet start, that parts of it mirrored her own life, her loneliness, her healing, even her rediscovery of silence. That night, when she looked up from the book, she caught Maeve watching her with a soft expression. "It's speaking to you, isn't it?" "Yes," Alara admitted. "It feels like it knows me." Maeve nodded slowly. "The library remembers what you cannot. It has a way of showing you what you need before you know you need it." Sometimes, Alara would stay until dawn, her eyelids heavy, but her soul awake. The library had no clocks. Time there felt unmeasured, fluid like the river itself. On some nights, she found other visitors too. They were quiet, dreamlike figures. An old man who always read the same poem near the fire. A young boy sketching constellations in the margins of a book. A woman in a green cloak humming to herself in the poetry aisle. She never spoke to them directly, but their presence was comforting, as though everyone there shared the same unspoken wish: to rest, to heal, to remember something gentle. One evening, as rain fell steadily outside, Maeve invited Alara into a smaller chamber behind the main hall. It was filled with shelves that seemed older, that were worn smooth from centuries of hands. "This is the heart of the library," Maeve said quietly. "Here are the books that the river itself has written." Alara's fingers brushed across a volume bound in weathered silver leather. Its cover bore no title, only a faint engraving of a ripple. When she opened it, she found the pages blank, until the rain outside grew louder and words began to appear on the paper, one by one. They were her own thoughts, her own memories, things she had never written down, things she had only ever felt. She stared at them in silence, her chest tightening with emotion. "It listens to you," Maeve said softly. "The river carries your story, and the library writes it. Every whisper you've given the water, every tear, every dream. Nothing is ever truly lost." Alara traced the words with trembling fingers. It was overwhelming, beautiful and strange and deeply intimate. She felt as though the world was holding her, saying, "I've heard you all along." After that night, she began to write deliberately, not in the silver book, but in her own small notebook. She wrote letters she would never send, dreams she didn't fully understand, moments of peace she wanted to remember. She wrote about the sound of lanterns swaying in the evening wind, about the scent of old pages, about the way Maeve's voice sounded like the sea. Writing became her quiet ritual, her prayer. Months passed, and the river changed again, golden summer giving way to crisp amber autumn. Alara had become part of Greystone Bend's rhythm. The townspeople, who once regarded her as a quiet stranger, now greeted her with warmth. She helped at the local cafe, tended flowers by her window, and shared small smiles with the baker, the mailman, the children by the docks. But the library remained her truest companion. It was more than a place. It was a feeling. The peace she had searched for all her life had taken form in that riverside sanctuary. One afternoon, As the first frost touched the edges of the world, Maeve handed her a folded piece of parchment. "It's almost time," she said softly. "Time for what?" "To give something back." The parchment contained a single sentence. Return to where the story began. That night, Alara crossed the bridge under a sky dusted with stars. The river was still and glassy, reflecting every shimmer of light. She sat by the water's edge, the same spot where she had first seen the library's glow. And there, in the quiet dark, she began to read aloud from her notebook, her own story. Her voice trembled at first, but soon it steadied. Each word carried softly across the water, rippling outward, disappearing into the night. When she finished, she closed her eyes, and for a long while, she simply listened. The river answered, faintly, musically, like laughter hidden in the current. And when she looked up, she saw hundreds of lanterns drifting downstream, golden and alive, as if the library itself was breathing her words back into the world. She watched until the last light faded around the bend, and then she understood what Maeve had meant. Every soul who came to the library left behind a part of their story, so others could find their way to peace. When Alara returned to the island the next day, the library's door stood open, waiting. Maeve greeted her not with words, but with a look that said everything. "You've listened well," she said finally. "Now, the library will always listen to you." Years later, people in Greystone Bend still spoke of the mysterious woman who had once lived near the river, the one who always walked at dusk and smiled as if she carried secret. And sometimes, when the night was still and the moonlight soft, they swore they could see lanterns drifting across the water, faint golden, like stars that had come down to rest. And if anyone ever followed them, they might just find themselves standing before a quiet door beneath an arch of ivy, hearing the hush of pages turning inside. The secret library by the river, waiting for the next soul who needed to be found. The days began to melt together like watercolor, soft edges, gentle transitions, and a rhythm that belonged to no clock. Alara's life had slowed to a tender pulse, one that matched the river's quiet breathing. She spent her mornings walking along the misty banks, her afternoons sketching the shapes of clouds and willow branches, and her nights inside the warm cocoon of the secret library, surrounded by the perfume of paper, tea, and rain. The library's lamps glowed like small suns suspended in amber glass, and their light shimmered on the water outside, making the river look alive, as if it were dreaming. Sometimes Alara thought she could see faint shapes moving beneath the surface. Not fish, but something softer, more ethereal, like memories drifting just out of reach. Maeve often said that the river held everything ever whispered to it. "It keeps secrets kindly," she told her one evening, her voice slow and melodic. "But it also remembers joy. That's why the water never truly sleeps." Alara began to wonder if her laughter, so rare in her old life, was now part of that current. She imagined it winding downstream, brushing past reeds and stones, mixing with the voices of others who had come before her. There was comfort in that thought, a kind of immortality that had nothing to do with fame or legacy. Just this simple continuation of sound, carried onward forever. As the nights grew cooler, Maeve started lighting a fire in the stone hearth of the library. Its crackling warmth made the wooden walls glow with a honeyed sheen. Alara often sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a cup of peppermint tea, her mind drifting between stories and dreams. Sometimes she fell asleep there, curled in a high-backed armchair, and when she awoke, Maeve would have draped a quilt over her shoulders, a patchwork of faded blues and creams, smelling faintly of lavender. In those moments, Alara realized she could not remember the last time she had felt so safe. One particularly misty evening, Maeve handed her a book she had never seen before. Its cover was pale gray, soft to the touch, like worn velvet. There was no title, only a single silver feather pressed into the center. "What's this one?" Alara asked. Maeve smiled knowingly. "That one chooses its reader. If it came to you, it's time you read it." Alara took it carefully, feeling the strange pulse of the book, faint but real, like a heartbeat. She opened the first page, and the air in the room seemed to shift. The The story began not with words, but with an image: a quiet river, a small house of stone, and a woman standing at the window, watching the rain. Her breath caught. It was her. Not exactly. Not her face, not her clothes, but the essence of her. The story that followed was eerily familiar. A woman who had once been lost in the noise of her own life, who had fled to the countryside in search of silence, and who had found a secret place where words carried weight and rivers remembered. As she read, she realized something deeper. The book wasn't finished. The story stopped midway through a sentence, as though waiting. Her fingers trembled on the page, and when she looked up, Maeve was watching her quietly. The story writes itself when the reader is ready, Maeve said softly. Perhaps it's waiting for your words. That night, Alara sat by the river under a velvet sky and began to write in the back of the book. Her handwriting wavered at first, but soon flowed smoothly. She wrote not just about herself, but about everything she had seen. The way the willow leaves whispered in the wind, the warmth of Maeve's tea, the endless hum of the water. She wrote until her candle burned low and the stars began to fade. When she looked down, the ink shimmered faintly, as though the river's reflection had soaked into it. Over the following weeks, she kept writing, each night adding more. And something remarkable began to happen. The story on the previous pages would shift slightly, sentences rephrasing themselves, images deepening, entire paragraphs moving like living things. It was as if the book were responding to her thoughts, reshaping itself to mirror the truth of what she felt rather than what she wrote. One evening, she awoke to find the book open on her desk, though she had closed it before going to sleep. A new page had appeared. It read, "When the river calls, follow the light." The next day, the sky was heavy with mist, and the river looked like silver glass. Alara stood at its edge, unsure what she was waiting for. Then, faintly through the fog, she saw a glimmer, a light flickering like a candle far downstream. It grew brighter, steadier, until she could see it clearly. A lantern, floating on the water, drifting toward her. She stepped into the shallows, her breath catching in her throat. The lantern stopped right at her feet, bobbing gently. Inside it, a folded piece of parchment rested against the glass. Alara lifted the lantern and opened the note inside. The words were written in delicate, looping ink. The story continues when the river listens back. She looked toward the library, its windows faintly glowing across the mist. And for the first time, she understood what Maeve had meant about the river's memory. It wasn't only a place that listened, it spoke. That night, Alara returned to the library, the lantern still burning softly in her hands. Maeve met her at the door. "You heard it," she said simply. "I did." "Then you know what comes next." Alara hesitated. "To write." Maeve smiled, and for the first time, her expression carried something ancient, timeless. To listen, they sat together by the fire in silence. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. And beneath that sound, Alara heard something else, faint, rhythmic like the turning of pages. The next morning, Maeve was gone. The library stood open, the lamps still lit, the books still humming faintly with the scent of rain. On the counter where Maeve usually sat was a small silver key and a note written in her elegant script. "Every keeper leaves when the next arrives. Welcome home, Alara." Her heart ached and bloomed all at once. She understood. The library was eternal, a place for wayfarers of the soul, those who needed rest, or remembrance, or peace. And now it was her turn to care for it, to listen, to keep the stories safe. From that day on, travelers who came to Greystone Bend sometimes spoke of a woman with soft eyes and a voice like rain who tended the small library by the river. They said she always seemed to know the story they needed before they asked for it. And at night, when the fog rolled thick across the water, lanterns would glow along the river's edge, hundreds of them, carrying the dreams of those who had come and gone. The secret library by the river was never silent, for it held the heartbeat of every story it had ever heard. And if you stood there long enough, you might hear your own voice, whispering softly in the current. The next few days unfolded like a dream Ilara never wanted to wake from. The world outside her small island library seemed to slow with her heartbeat. Mornings came in soft shades of rose and pearl, the river whispering beneath a blanket of fog. Afternoons stretched into golden stillness, broken only by the lazy rustle of leaves or the gentle flutter of pages stirred by a passing breeze. Inside the library, time became something fluid, something that flowed rather than passed. The ticking of clocks, once an anxious reminder of things undone, seemed to dissolve into the quiet hum of stories breathing around her. Books lined the walls in spirals of wood and brass, some stacked so high that they disappeared into the soft shadows of the rafters. Lanterns hung low, their light trembling like living hearts. Sometimes, when Ilara walked between the shelves, she could swear the books whispered to one another, not in words she could understand, but in the soft rustle of turning pages, in the creak of bindings, in the faint scent of rain-soaked paper. It wasn't frightening, only strange and profoundly beautiful. She learned that the library changed depending on her mood. When she was joyful, sunlight poured through windows that hadn't been there before. When she was lonely, the air grew heavy with the scent of lilac and tea. When she was uncertain, the shelves seemed to breathe closer, offering her stories of those who had once been lost and had found themselves again. Each night, after closing the door to the world outside, she would light a candle and read. She read about forgotten kingdoms, about friendships that outlasted lifetimes, about rivers that carried wishes instead of water. Each story seemed to blend with the sound of the river outside, its rhythm slow and eternal. But sometimes, when the rain fell hardest, she began to hear something else. A faint sound, so soft she thought it might be her imagination, of someone humming. It was always the same tune, low and old, full of comfort and ache. The first time she heard it, she froze, the hair on her arms lifting slightly. When she asked Maeve about it, before she vanished, the older woman had simply said, "The river hums for those who listen long enough." Now, Ilara wondered if it was the river she was hearing, or something, or someone else. One evening, unable to resist the pull, she followed the sound. It led her down a narrow spiral staircase at the back of the library, a place she hadn't noticed before. Each step creaked softly, and the air grew cooler, thick with the scent of moss and stone. At the bottom, she found a round room, its ceiling arched like the inside of a shell. In the center of the room was a shallow pool, perfectly still. Lanterns floated on its surface, their flames unbothered by the airless calm. The walls were covered in tiny drawers, each labeled with names. Not book titles, but human names written in elegant cursive. She knelt beside the pool and reached out to touch the water. It was cool, almost cold, and when her fingers brushed the surface, the pool rippled. Not outwards, but inward, as though the water drew her touch toward its center. Then she heard again the humming. It rose from the water, soft at first, then clearer. It wasn't a song of joy or sorrow. It was something deeper, a melody of memory. Ilara's reflection shimmered, and for a moment, it wasn't hers. A woman with long dark hair, eyes full of stars, and a smile both kind and melancholy looked back at her. Startled, she drew back. The reflection rippled and returned to her own face. But the humming didn't stop. A drawer behind her slid open with a faint sigh. Inside it lay a small piece of parchment. Her name was written on it. Her breath caught. She unfolded the note. It read, in neat, delicate handwriting, "The river knows your heart before you do. Listen, you'll remember what you've forgotten." Ilara sat there for a long time, the words burning softly in her mind. What had she forgotten? Her life before Greystone Bend was clear in memory, but perhaps not in feeling. She remembered facts, the job, the noise, the fatigue, but not the deeper things, not the woman she had been before the exhaustion, before she forgot how to dream. She closed the drawer gently, as though afraid to wake something sleeping. Then she stood and whispered into the quiet, "I'm ready to remember." The air trembled faintly. The lantern flames fluttered. Somewhere above, the shelves groaned softly, as though shifting in approval. That night, when she returned to her writing desk. The book she had been working on was open to a new page. A sentence had appeared in elegant script. Memory is not what you keep, it's what refuses to leave. Alara smiled faintly. She began to write again, and this time, the words came easily. She wrote of her childhood, of a house by the sea where her mother had read to her by candlelight, of the sound of gulls and the smell of salt on warm evenings. She wrote of her father's stories, of promises she'd forgotten to keep. The words felt like stepping into light after years in shadow. When she finished, the book glowed faintly in the candlelight. She placed her hand on it, and for a heartbeat, the pages pulsed beneath her palm. Then, in the stillness of the night, the humming from the river returned, softer now, like a lullaby. Alara leaned back, eyes half closed, the sound wrapping around her like a blanket. The rain outside had begun again, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beat of her heart. She let it wash over her, the sound of water, of wind, of her own quiet breathing. And for the first time in years, she felt at home. The secret library by the river was no longer just a place. It was alive. It was waiting, and would always remember her. The days that followed flowed together like colors in watercolor, gentle, blending, never quite separate. The rhythm of Alara's life at the secret library settled into something peaceful, timeless. Each morning began with the soft golden shimmer of dawn filtering through the tall, arched windows. She would open the doors and let the crisp river air glide through the rooms, stirring pages and waking up the scent of old parchment. The books seemed to sigh in greeting, as though happy to be touched by the light. Sometimes she would make tea, chamomile, or mint, sometimes lavender, and place a steaming cup on the desk by the window that overlooked the water. The river would glitter in the light, slow and reflective, as if listening to its own quiet song. It had moods, she realized. On some days, it moved lazily, content and silver. On others, it rippled with excitement, carrying with it the laughter of unseen things. And sometimes, on nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, the river shone with its own inner glow, like liquid moonlight. Alara loved those nights most of all. The library seemed to come alive after sunset. Candles burned low in every corner, and the air grew thick with warmth and the faint scent of sandalwood. The hum of the river mingled with the whisper of turning pages. Shadows danced across the walls, not dark, but soft, like the flickering shapes of stories finding their way into being. She would sit near the window with her notebook, wrapped in a knitted blanket, and write until her eyelids grew heavy. Often, she didn't realize when she'd fallen asleep until she woke to the sound of the river in the early light of morning, her notebook filled with words she couldn't remember writing. Some nights, she dreamed of the woman in the water, the reflection that wasn't hers. The woman would smile at her with that same knowing gentleness and whisper, "Keep listening. The river remembers for you." It was a mystery that no longer frightened Alara. In fact, it comforted her. There was something profoundly soothing in believing that memory, true memory, lived not just in minds, but in places, in rivers, and stories in silence. Weeks passed. The days grew cooler. The leaves outside turned from green to gold to amber, and the sound of the river deepened with autumn's slow rhythm. The villagers in Greystone Bend began to notice her. When she walked into town for supplies, flour, candles, ink, people would smile and wave. Some asked gently about the library. "Oh, it's beautiful," Alara would say. "It feels like it's always been waiting." The baker's wife once told her, "They say the library was built on a forgotten spring. My grandmother used to tell us that the water there remembers everything it touches." Alara smiled. Maybe that's true. As the first frost arrived, she began to see something curious. Strangers standing by the riverbank at twilight. They didn't seem lost, but rather drawn, as though hearing something she too had once followed. They would gaze toward the library's soft glow, hesitate, and then slowly cross the little bridge that led to her door. The first visitor was a man in his 50s, carrying a battered satchel and a look of quiet sorrow. He told her he had once been a writer long ago, but had stopped after losing his wife. The words had dried up. Alara welcomed him in. She poured tea. She said, "Perhaps you haven't lost the words. Perhaps they've just been waiting here for you." He stayed for 3 days. When he left, he looked lighter, his eyes brightened with something like peace. On the desk where he had been writing, Alara found a page of poetry, simple, beautiful, raw, left behind like an offering. After that, more visitors came. A young woman with tired eyes who had forgotten how to sleep. A retired teacher who missed the laughter of children. A painter who hadn't touched a brush in years. Each came to the library with something missing, and each left with something found. The river seemed to bring them, one by one. And every time someone arrived, Alara felt that faint hum deepen, as though the library itself was glad to have company again. At night, she would sit by the fire with her guests. They would speak softly, voices mingling with the sound of crackling wood and the sigh of wind. They told stories, sometimes their own, sometimes ones they'd never dare to share. It wasn't like any storytelling Alara had ever known. It was slower, softer, as if the telling itself was a way of healing. The library listened. The books on the shelves seemed to lean closer, pages half open, as though the words spoken aloud wove themselves into new stories that would live forever here. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Alara stayed awake by the fire. The flames burned low, throwing waves of golden light across the room. She felt that presence again, the woman in the reflection, not as a vision, but as a warmth beside her. She whispered into the stillness, "Who are you?" The flames flickered, and for a moment, the shadow beside her seemed to take form, delicate, luminous. A voice, soft as breath, answered, "Once I was the keeper of this place. Now I am its memory. And you, Alara, you are its future." Alara's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't know why. "Why me? Because you still believe in quiet things. Because you listen." The warmth faded, but the peace lingered. The fire crackled softly. The river hummed its ancient song, and outside, snow began to fall, slow, soundless, silver. From that night on, the library became more than a refuge. It became a sanctuary. People would come not because they sought answers, but because they sought stillness, the kind of stillness that only places with long memories could offer. Alara began to leave journals out on the table for her guests, blank pages, open invitations. She told them to write whatever came, even if it was nonsense, even if it was pain. Some drew, some wrote poems, some simply wrote their names and dates. But each entry felt sacred, as though the library collected not just stories, but fragments of the human heart. By spring, the shelves held not only old books, but new ones, small leather-bound volumes filled with the words of those who had found rest here. Alara would walk through the aisles in the evenings, fingertips brushing the spines, listening. She could hear it now, the layered hum of every voice that had ever spoken here, every story told, every tear shed, every laugh released into the warm lamplight. It was beautiful, and one night, as she watched the river shimmer under a moon that looked impossibly close, she realized something profound. She no longer dreamed of escape or of elsewhere. The secret library by the river was no longer a mystery to her. It was a living, breathing promise that no story, no matter how quiet, would ever be forgotten. Alara leaned against the window, the soft flicker of candlelight dancing on her face, and whispered to the night, "Thank you." The river whispered back, low and endless, carrying her words away like a lullaby. As the seasons turned once again, time in the secret library began to take on a rhythm that felt less like passing and more like breathing. The air in spring carried a soft sweetness, the scent of blooming willows and river mint drifting through the windows. Birds sang just outside, their calls mingling with the rustle of pages as Alara moved quietly through the library, dusting, rearranging, and tending to the ever-growing collection of memories. The journals from her visitors had multiplied. Each one held fragments of lives that had crossed the river to find rest. Some were neatly written, others hurried and smudged with tears or laughter. Every time she opened one, She could feel the echo of its writer, a whisper of their presence still lingering between the lines. One afternoon, as the sunlight spilled across the old oak table, Alara came across a book she hadn't noticed before. Its cover was plain, soft brown leather worn smooth from use. There was no name on it, no date, just a single pressed flower tucked into the first page, a pale blue forget-me-not. Inside, the handwriting was delicate, familiar somehow. The words read, "To whoever finds this, know that the river remembers you. It carries your story, even when you no longer can. When you sit by the fire, when you listen to the rain, you are part of something endless." Alara smiled. She didn't know who had written it, but it felt like a message meant for her, a gentle reassurance that what she was doing mattered. She closed the book and set it beside the others, a small piece of the great living memory that surrounded her. In summer, the days stretched long and golden. Sunlight glimmered on the river, and the air was filled with the lazy hum of dragonflies. Alara began to spend her afternoons outside beneath the willow trees, a blanket spread beneath her with a teapot and a few of her favorite books. Sometimes, villagers would join her, bringing bread or fruit to share. They would sit together by the water, saying little, simply listening. The laughter of children would drift across the meadow, mingling with the soothing rush of the current. Alara often thought of how far she had come, from the restless nights in the city, from the constant noise and weight of unanswered questions. Here, at the edge of the river, she had found the quiet she hadn't known she was searching for. Not silence, exactly, but peace, a kind of stillness that lived in her bones now. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and silver, a storm began to gather on the horizon. The clouds moved slowly, like shadows coming to rest. The first drops of rain fell with a soft patter, and soon the sound deepened into a steady rhythm, a lullaby of water. Alara sat by the open window, a candle burning beside her, and watched the rain sweep across the river. The sound was hypnotic, the scent of earth and rain filling the air. The library seemed to breathe with it. The wood creaked softly, the books swelled with the moisture, the candles flickered like tiny hearts. She thought of all the people who had come through these doors, of the tears shed, the laughter shared, the words whispered into the quiet. She thought of the river, the mysterious presence that had always seemed to listen. She thought of the woman in the reflection, the keeper of memory. And in that moment, she realized something deeper than she ever had before. This library, this river, this quiet. It wasn't just a place. It was a kind of love. A love that existed in the act of listening, of remembering, of allowing stories to live on. As the rain fell harder, she closed her eyes. The sound was so soothing that it wrapped around her like a blanket. She could almost hear voices in it, faint, familiar, timeless. The sound of every person who had ever come here. The stories that had been told, the ones still waiting to be written. And then, softly, the voice she had come to know so well, the one from her dreams, spoke again. "Do you see, Alara? Every story leaves a light. Even when the fire fades, even when the rain falls, the light remains." She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I see it now," she whispered. The rain continued through the night, softening into a gentle drizzle. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting warm light across the floor. Alara fell asleep by the window, her head resting against the sill, the river's lullaby carrying her dreams downstream. When morning came, the world was washed clean. The sky glowed pale and golden, and the river shimmered like glass. Mist rose in delicate ribbons from the surface, drifting around the willows and disappearing into the sunlight. The air was so still it felt sacred. Alara woke slowly, stretching, the scent of damp earth in her lungs. She moved through the library quietly, lighting a few candles though the day was already bright. The warmth of the flames felt comforting. She made herself tea, poured it into her favorite mug, chipped but beautiful, and carried it outside to the small wooden bench by the river. She sat there for a long while, sipping slowly, watching the water move. And then, without quite knowing why, She began to speak, softly, as if talking to the river itself. "Thank you," she said, "for every story, for the quiet, for helping me remember who I am." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of jasmine and rain. The surface of the river rippled once, twice, as though in reply. Time flowed gently after that. Years passed, but they didn't seem to weigh on her. The library aged gracefully, the books multiplying, the walls lined with warmth. Children who had once visited with their parents returned as adults, bringing new stories, new voices. Alara's hair turned silver like the river in moonlight, and her hands grew softer, slower, but her eyes still held that spark, that quiet wonder. In her final years, she wrote her own book, not for anyone else, but for the library. She filled it with her memories of every visitor, every sound, every dream. She wrote about the woman in the reflection, about the night she first arrived, about the peace she had found here. And when she finished, she placed it on the highest shelf beside the book with the pressed forget-me-not. That night, as she sat by the fire one last time, the room glowed golden. The river hummed just beyond the window. Alara closed her eyes, listening. The voice came softly again, like the faintest melody. "You have kept the light, Alara. Now rest. The stories will remember." She smiled, and the candlelight flickered gently over her peaceful face. Outside, the river moved with quiet grace, carrying reflections of moonlight and willow leaves. The library stood calm and alive, a keeper of memories, a cradle of dreams. And deep within its heart, the sound of turning pages continued, steady, timeless, eternal. The secret library by the river breathed on, forever listening, forever remembering, forever whispering to anyone who came close enough to hear. Every story is a light, and no light is ever lost. The moon had grown full again, casting its tender reflection over the rippling waters of the river. The secret library seemed to shimmer beneath that pale glow, as though it too had absorbed some of the moonlight through its wooden beams and weathered stones. Inside, the fire burned low, and the air smelled of old parchment, lavender, and time itself. Alara sat at her table, surrounded by journals and letters, their pages fluttering gently as if stirred by invisible hands. She was older now, her hair a soft cascade of silver, her skin lined with stories of laughter, sadness, and years of peace. Yet her eyes remained bright, filled with that same quiet curiosity that had guided her to this place so long ago. The river murmured outside, steady and unhurried, its voice as familiar to her now as her own breath. It was no longer a mystery or a force to fear. It was a companion, a confidant, a keeper of her days. And tonight, as she listened, she could almost hear the faint echoes of the people who had come and gone through her doors. There was the sound of the little boy who used to visit every afternoon, his laughter bright and free as he learned to read by the window. There was the soft hum of the woman who had lost her husband and found solace in copying old poems by candlelight. There was the deep chuckle of the man who repaired the book's bindings every winter, and the whisper of the girl who had fallen asleep with her head on the desk, dreaming of distant lands. They had all left something behind, their voices, their warmth, their light, and together they made a kind of music that filled the room with life even when it was empty. Alara took her pen and dipped it in ink, her hand trembling slightly, but her movements sure. She began to write again, not to record new memories, but to honor the old ones. Her handwriting flowed across the page, looping and curling, the candlelight catching the glint of the ink. "The river keeps every story," she wrote, "even the ones we forget, even the ones we never tell aloud. It carries them softly beneath the surface until they become part of something larger, part of everything." She paused, listening again. The rain had begun to fall outside, faint and musical, each drop like a note played on glass. It drummed against the roof, against the leaves of the willows, against the window panes that had seen countless seasons come and go. Alara smiled faintly. There was something in that sound, something eternal. The rain grew heavier, and she rose slowly, walking toward the door. When she stepped outside, the night wrapped around her in silver mist. The air was cool and clean, and the scent of rain-drenched earth filled her lungs. She walked down the small path that led to the water's edge, her bare feet sinking into the soft moss. The river shimmered before her, dark and alive, reflecting the lantern light from the library windows. The current whispered her name, or perhaps it was just her imagination. But then again, this place had always blurred the line between what was real and what was dreamed. She knelt beside the river and trailed her fingers through the water. It was cold, but gentle, curling around her hand like an old friend. She thought of the first night she had found this place, how lost she had felt, how heavy the world had seemed. Now that heaviness was gone, what filled her instead was an expansive calm, like the hush between two waves. "I've done all I could," she whispered, "and it's enough." The river didn't answer in words, but its current seemed to slow, to listen. Alara rose again and made her way back inside. The library glowed softly in the dim light, books stacked high, candles flickering low. She moved through the aisles one last time, her hand gliding over the spines. Oak, leather, linen, all of them humming faintly with remembered touch. When she reached the table, she found her journal still open. On the last page, the ink had dried into a silvery sheen. She dipped her pen once more and wrote a single line. "Every ending is a beginning remembered." Then she closed the book gently and set the pen aside. As the hours deepened, the rain softened into a steady, soothing rhythm. Alara sat in her chair, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and let the sound cradle her. Her eyelids grew heavy. The fire dimmed, flickered, then glowed a soft ember red. Outside, dawn was beginning to rise, the faintest light spilling over the horizon, brushing the mist with gold. The river shimmered in the newborn light, carrying with it the whispers of every story that had ever been told here. When the sun finally lifted above the trees, its rays slipped through the windows of the library, touching the shelves, the papers, and the quiet figures seated by the fire. Alara had fallen asleep, her face peaceful, her hands resting over the closed journal. The pages beneath her fingertips glowed faintly in the morning light, as though the words themselves had absorbed her warmth. And somewhere deep within the river's song, her voice joined the others, gentle, eternal, part of the never-ending rhythm of stories that flowed beneath the world. Years later, travelers who came across the hidden path by the river would sometimes find their way to the library. They would push open the creaking wooden door and feel a calm wash over them, a quiet so full it felt alive. The fire would always be burning, and the books would always seem to shift ever so slightly, as though rearranging themselves to welcome the new arrival. And if those travelers stayed long enough, they might hear it too, a faint voice like the whisper of wind through leaves, saying, "You're home now. Tell your story. The river is listening." The secret library by the river endured through the seasons, through generations, through time itself. Its shelves grew, its windows opened to endless dawns, and its spirit, the spirit of memory, of kindness, of peace, continued to glow like a lantern on the water. No one ever truly found the library twice, but everyone who left it carried something back into the world, a little more stillness, a little more warmth, a little more light. And the river kept flowing, as it always had, humming softly under the stars, forever remembering, forever dreaming, forever telling the stories of all who had once paused long enough to listen. The morning mist clung to the edges of the water like a memory unwilling to fade. The secret library by the river breathed in that soft dawn air as if the world itself were pausing for one long, tender moment of silence. The fire had burned down to pale ash, and faint ribbons of smoke curled upward toward the open rafters, catching the early sunlight that streamed through the round window above Alara's reading desk. Outside, the river whispered with a voice made of light, a slow, shimmering melody that wound its way between the trees and through the heart of the library itself. The door creaked open slightly in the breeze, and somewhere, a page turned on its own, as though guided by unseen fingers. The entire building seemed alive, dreaming, remembering. Alara was gone now. Not lost, not vanished, but woven into the fabric of the place she had loved. Her chair by the window remained exactly as she had left it, her shawl folded neatly across the back, her teacup still resting on the small wooden table beside her final journal. When the sunlight touched the cup, a faint glimmer of reflection rippled across the surface, dancing briefly on the open pages of her writing. Visitors still came. Not many, only those the river seemed to call. They would wander down the winding paths that led through the willows, following the sound of flowing water until they saw it. A small stone building half covered in ivy, its windows warm with golden light. The air around it always smelled faintly of rain and paper, and those who found it never quite knew how long they had been walking or how they had arrived. They would step inside and feel it instantly, the deep quiet, the sense that the world outside had slowed, that here, time was something gentle and circular rather than sharp and rushing. The shelves would seem to reach endlessly upward, lined with books that whispered softly as though sighing with contentment. And always, there was the sound of the river, constant and near, like a heartbeat in the floorboards. Some visitors would find their way to Alara's journal, still kept on the central table. Its leather had darkened with age, the edges softened by countless hands. When opened, it smelled faintly of lavender and ink, and the writing flowed in delicate loops across each page. Those who read her words would often find themselves crying quietly, not from sorrow, but from the strange, exquisite peace that seemed to rise from every line. Alara had written of the river's patience, of the way it held every reflection without judgment, of how every person carried within them a small, shimmering current of their own story. She had written of nights spent by the fire, of laughter shared with strangers who became family, of the magic in ordinary moments when one simply paused to listen. There was one passage near the end of the journal that seemed to touch everyone who read it. The river doesn't ask for our best days or our brightest words. It carries everything, even the silence, even the unfinished. It reminds us that every story matters, even the ones that drift away before they end. Perhaps that's what peace really is, the knowing that we belong, even when we've stopped speaking. After reading that, visitors would often close the journal softly and step outside, standing at the edge of the water. Some would toss in a leaf, or a flower, or simply their breath, a small offering of gratitude. And as they watched the current carry it away, they would feel something loosen in their chest, some weight they hadn't realized they were holding. And so the river continued to listen, as it always had, through spring rains and autumn winds, through winter frost and summer bloom. It whispered through the reeds and over the stones, carrying stories far beyond what any one life could hold. Sometimes, on still nights when the moon hung low and the fire inside the library flickered softly, travelers swore they could see her. Alara, standing at the window, her hair silver like the light on water, her gaze turned toward the river. She would smile, faint and knowing, as though greeting an old friend. And then, with the next shift of wind or ripple of light, she would be gone again, only the scent of jasmine and ink lingering in the air. Over time, the world around the river changed. Roads were built, towns grew, and people forgot the winding paths that led to the hidden clearing. But every so often, when the night grew very quiet and the stars gathered close, the library would appear again to someone who needed it. A lost soul, a weary traveler, a dreamer too tired to keep searching. The river would guide them there, just as it had guided Alara once upon a time. Inside, they would find warmth and tea waiting on the stove, and a chair by the window where they could sit and breathe. They would read a little, write a little, sleep a little, and when they left, they would carry with them something invisible yet undeniable, the feeling of having been deeply seen, deeply understood. Because that was the library's true gift. It didn't offer answers. It didn't change who you were. It simply gave you space, a stillness wide enough for your story to unfold. As centuries passed, the legend of the secret library by the river became a bedtime tale whispered to children, a myth told by travelers around fires, a rumor shared in soft voices in crowded cities. Some said the library was gone forever. Others claimed that on misty mornings, if you stood by the right bend in the water and closed your eyes, you could hear pages turning. And those who had truly been there, who had walked its halls, who had heard the river's voice, they never argued. They would simply smile and say, "Some places don't need to be found twice." In the hush of twilight, when the world seems to hold its breath, the river still glimmers. The moon rises, silver and patient, and the willows sway in rhythm with a song too old for words. The library glows faintly between the trees, its light soft and golden, like a memory dreaming itself awake. Inside, a candle burns beside an open book. The pages shift in the breeze. The river hums, and somewhere, far within that endless sound, the voice of Alara can still be heard. Calm, gentle, unending, every story is a light, and every light returns to the river. The secret library by the river remains, timeless and unseen, forever waiting for the next traveler who dares to listen.